There are seasons in life when the absence of love screams louder than the presence of pain. Seasons where you look around, hoping for a hand to hold, a voice to soothe, a heart to understand, and find none. You stand in a room full of people and still you feel like a ghost. Not because you're invisible, but because you're not truly seen. You speak and yet no one hears the depth of your cry. You weep and the silence replies with its cold, merciless echo. These are the valleys where loneliness is not just a passing feeling. It becomes your shadow, your companion, your teacher. And in these moments of profound isolation, there comes another pain layered on top, the pain of betrayal. You were already standing alone, barely keeping yourself upright, and then they pushed. They didn't just ignore you. They hurt you when you were already low. When your heart was fragile, they shattered it further. When your spirit was gasping for breath, they suffocated it. When you reached for help, they recoiled or withdrew altogether. The very ones you hoped would be your refuge became the reason you ran. But here is where the mystery of the divine unfolds, not in the abundance of comfort, but in the barrenness of your darkest hours. Because when all else left, something remained. And not just something, someone. The invisible became visible. The silent became the only voice you could hear. In the crushing stillness, in the wreckage of your soul, God stepped in, not with thunder or trumpet blasts, not with dramatic displays, but with stillness, with presence, with the kind of intimacy only pain can teach us to recognize. He became everything, not out of competition with others, but because there were no others left. The spaces that people vacated, he filled. The emptiness they left behind, he occupied. And where human comfort failed, divine presence overwhelmed. There is something sacred about the moment you realize God is not just an idea, not just a belief system passed down to you, but a reality. A living, moving, breathing presence that comes closest when life has pushed everyone else away. You were never truly alone. That's the irony, isn't it? What felt like abandonment was actually a setup for encounter. You thought they walked out and left you to die, but they had to walk out so he could walk in. If they stayed, maybe you would have leaned on them. If they had comforted you, maybe you would have clung to them, but they didn't. And so you discovered that the one who remains is more than enough. This is the divine paradox. The less you had, the more he showed. The more you were hurt, the deeper his healing ran. When your words dried up and you had nothing left to pray, his spirit groaned on your behalf. When the tears blurred your vision, and you didn't know how to take another step, his hand guided your trembling feet. He became your friend when you had none. He became your protector when no one defended you. He became your whisper in the night, your light in the shadows, your voice in the silence. He became your everything. Let them wonder how you're still standing. Let them question how you didn't fall apart after all that they did. The answer is not found in your strength. It's found in the one who carried you when your legs gave out. They thought they could break you because they thought you were alone. They didn't know that behind your quiet cries and fragile body was a power greater than anything they could comprehend. They thought they were fighting you. They were actually wrestling with the grace that covered you. And grace doesn't lose battles. Grace wins silently. There is no vindication like divine vindication, no comfort like the embrace of heaven when earth turns cold, no love like the love of God when human affection fails. You were hurt when you were at your most vulnerable, and that was not a coincidence. That was a divine moment, an appointment with transformation, because in the unraveling of everything, the eternal began to weave you back together, not as you were, but as who you were meant to become. If only they knew what they did for you, If only they knew that their cruelty became your awakening. If only they understood that their absence introduced you to the fullness of God. But they don't need to know, because this isn't about them anymore. This is about you and the sacred journey that only pain could initiate. This is about the spiritual rebirth that emerged from your emotional grave. And most of all, this is about the one who found you at rock bottom, not to judge, but to rebuild you into something eternal. Pain changes the texture of your perception. It sharpens your awareness, not only of who is around you, but more deeply who is not. And when those you trusted to walk with you suddenly disappear, when the voices you leaned on grow silent, when the hands you thought would catch you let you fall, there's a breaking that happens, not just in the body, but in the soul. A fracture that no human glue can mend. It is in that breakage that the light begins to pour in. But it doesn't feel like light at first. It feels like abandonment, like betrayal, like the universe conspired against you and let the world collapse beneath your feet. It feels like divine silence. You cry out to God, and there is no immediate answer. You search for a sign, but the sky remains still. You begin to question everything, your worth, your purpose, your future. You begin to ask, why me? And in those silent tears, in that aching confusion, something ancient and holy begins to stir. God doesn't always respond in ways the world would notice. He doesn't announce his arrival with lightning when your heart breaks. Instead, he draws near in quiet ways, through a moment of peace that makes no sense, a strength that rises up from nowhere, a whisper in the back of your spirit, telling you to keep going when everything in you says to give up. And if you are still enough, honest enough, open enough, you'll begin to realize it is not the absence of sound that defines silence, but the presence of God within it. He came to you like that, quiet, gentle, present. The betrayal didn't scare him. Your weakness didn't make him retreat. Your confusion didn't offend him. In fact, it welcomed him, because he is never closer than when your world falls apart. And when every door closes, his becomes the only one that matters. You may not have understood it at first, but over time, you started to see the thread of his fingerprints. You noticed how you didn't drown, even when the waves of sorrow hit hardest. You noticed how your heart, though bleeding, kept beating. You noticed how, somehow, you kept waking up, kept breathing, kept moving forward, even if all you had was a single step in you. There is divine strength hidden in survival. You weren't just barely making it. You were being carried. You were being held in the invisible arms of the one who knew this moment would come and had already prepared the comfort before the pain arrived. The people who hurt you did not ruin you. They revealed what was fragile, yes, but in doing so, they also revealed what was unbreakable. Your spirit, your capacity for hope, your longing for something deeper, truer, eternal. And they revealed something else too, that the world may wound you, but it cannot define you. Only God can do that. So, he stepped into your isolation, not just to soothe, but to speak life over the places others spoke death. He became your voice when no one defended you. He became your healer when others walked away from your wounds. He rewrote the story they tried to ruin, and in doing so, he turned the very place of your breaking into the birthplace of something sacred. It wasn't instant. Healing never is. It came in waves, in whispers, in quiet revolutions of the soul. Some days it looked like silence. Other days it looked like small victories, getting out of bed, smiling again, speaking your truth. And all along, God was there, not watching from a distance, but walking with you in the ashes of what they left behind. Let that sink in. What they abandoned, God inhabited. What they mocked, God honored. What they destroyed, God began to rebuild, not with the same bricks, but with better ones, stronger ones, eternal ones. He is not a restorer who just patches old things. He makes all things new. And you, even with your scars, are being made new. Perhaps that's what they'll never understand. They thought breaking you meant ending you, but they underestimated the power of divine presence. You were not alone, even when they made you feel like you were. You were not forgotten, even when they made you believe you didn't matter. You were not empty, even when they walked away, because when they left, He entered. When they stopped seeing your worth, He revealed your value. When they hurt you at your lowest, He lifted you with a strength they could never comprehend. You didn't survive because of them. You survived in spite of them. That's the part of the story they can't erase. That's the testimony that doesn't need an audience to be true. It just is. You were shattered, yes, but not abandoned. You were bleeding, but not forsaken. You were betrayed, but not forgotten. And through every tear, every tremble, every moment of silence where your soul cried out for rescue, God was becoming everything you didn't know you needed. Not just a comforter, not just a provider, but the essence of love itself. He didn't just fill the gaps they left, He overwhelmed them. He didn't just replace what was broken, He offered something better. Himself. The deepest transformations are rarely loud. They happen in quiet hours, in hidden places, in sacred solitude. And what you endured, what they did, when you were already walking alone, was not the end of you. It was the beginning of something invisible but indestructible. You didn't just survive a season of abandonment. You entered a holy classroom, one that taught you the difference between dependence and devotion, one that stripped you of illusions and pointed you toward truth. The pain refined your vision, the betrayal adjusted your hearing. You began to discern between noise and voice, between distraction and direction. And in that stillness, in that agonizing emptiness, you met the one who fills without effort and heals without delay. It was in your isolation that He began to teach you not only how to walk again, but how to soar. Because the truth is, you were never created to be carried by others indefinitely. Relationships are beautiful, support is valuable, but dependency can become a chain. So when they hurt you and left, it felt like you lost your foundation. But that foundation was already cracked. God let it crumble, not to destroy you, but to rebuild you on solid ground, where your hope no longer leaned on fragile people, but on an eternal presence. You didn't just cry to be heard. You cried to be reborn. And rebirth takes place in silence, in obscurity, like a seed hidden in the soil. You were buried beneath disappointment, heartbreak, and rejection. But that burial wasn't the end. It was the preparation. What others saw as your death was actually your planting. And from that dark, unseen place, roots began to grow. Strong roots, quiet roots. God was preparing something they couldn't see. And because they couldn't see it, they misjudged it. They thought you were finished. They thought they had silenced your voice, stolen your strength, mocked your existence, and walked away, believing they had the final word. But only God writes final words. And He wasn't finished, because in the very same space where they walked out, He walked in. And when God enters, He doesn't come to explain why people failed you. He comes to show you that His presence is enough to redeem the pain, rewrite the story, and reverse the damage, not just so you can smile again, but so you can stand in the same place you once fell, and this time remain unshaken. Their betrayal unlocked your intimacy with the divine. Their silence drew you deeper into holy conversation. Their absence created a void only heaven could fill, and heaven did not delay. It's easy to think the miracle is in the restoration of relationships or the reversal of circumstances, but the real miracle is this: you found joy again, not because someone gave it to you, but because God planted it in the soil of your suffering. You found peace, not from the world, but in spite of it. You found strength, not from applause, but from quiet mornings where only you and God knew what it took to get out of bed. That's power. That's sacred. That's divine. They may never apologize. They may never return. They may never acknowledge how deeply they hurt you when you had nothing left. But they don't need to, because your healing was never dependent on their remorse. Your redemption was never in their hands. God was the one holding the pen, and while they were writing endings, He was drafting beginnings. And now, the person who once wept alone is walking in a strength not their own. The soul once forgotten is now crowned with favor. The voice once silenced is now singing. Not because the pain didn't happen, but because the pain didn't win. You see, when God becomes your everything, people can no longer be your undoing. They can lie, they can leave, they can hurt, but they cannot control what God is building within you. They don't hold the keys to your future. They don't own your joy. They don't have the authority to define your worth. That belongs to God. And when He becomes your center, your anchor, your home, nothing and no one can remove you from His grip. There is peace in knowing that, a deep, unshakable peace. The kind that doesn't depend on validation or explanation, the kind that lets you walk past the ruins of what they left behind without bitterness in your heart. Because you're no longer chasing closure, you're walking in resurrection. And resurrection doesn't need permission. It doesn't need applause. It only needs God. And you have Him, not as a distant idea, but as a living presence. That presence is what changed you, not the passage of time, not the disappearance of pain, but the intimacy you found in the midst of it. The companionship of God in your emptiest hour, the assurance that you are not abandoned, not invisible, not discarded. You are chosen. You are cherished, and you are carried by a love that never falters, even when people do. The journey from brokenness to wholeness is not a straight path. It is filled with moments of trembling, moments of doubt, moments where you think you've healed, only to find a memory that still bleeds. But healing is not perfection, it is resurrection. And resurrection always begins in a grave. They left you there. That's the part they'll never admit. When you needed someone most, they abandoned the moment. You weren't asking for everything, just someone, just presence, just the kind of love that doesn't walk out when life grows heavy. But they couldn't carry it. Or maybe they didn't want to. Maybe your pain was too real for their shallow hearts. Maybe your cries didn't echo in their ears the way they thundered in your chest. So they vanished, quietly or harshly, with words that stabbed or with silence that bruised. And the hardest part? You still looked for them. You waited, hoped, believed they'd come back, or at least acknowledge what they did. But they never did. They went on with their lives as if you were a chapter they had the right to close. But you weren't a chapter. You were a soul a soul they wounded and walked away from, leaving you to bandage your heart alone. But here's the truth they never expected. You didn't stay buried, because while they left you in a pit, heaven sent provision. You were never meant to die there. That sorrow wasn't your end, it was your rebirth. God found you in the place others forgot. He stepped into your pit, not to pity you, but to pull you out. He descended into the shadows of your story and lit a fire so strong it would burn through every lie they told you about your worth. And they said you were too much. God said you were beautifully made. They said you'd never recover. God said He'd restore you in front of the same people who doubted you. They thought their betrayal would define you, but God redefined you in the very place you were broken. That's what they missed. While they were crafting their lives without you, God was crafting His image within you. And that image is not one of defeat. It's not a reflection of their cruelty. It's not the shape of your sorrow. It is the imprint of the divine, unshakable, unmovable, radiant with purpose. You may have been crushed, but never destroyed, abandoned, but never orphaned, betrayed, but never unloved. You began to rise, not all at once, not with loud declarations or sudden triumphs, but slowly, in sacred steps, with a whisper of strength here, a flicker of hope there. You rose when you dared to believe again. You rose when you laughed in the middle of grief. You rose when you chose kindness, even when bitterness begged to be your language. You rose when you saw beauty in places that once reminded you of pain, and God rose with you. Every moment you thought you were walking alone, He was beside you, not just watching but sustaining. You didn't feel strong because it wasn't your strength, it was His. You didn't feel brave because it wasn't your courage, it was His Spirit living through you, pushing you forward when the weight tried to pull you under. They can't understand it because they weren't there for it. They weren't in the midnight hour when you cried into the darkness. They didn't hear the prayers you couldn't say aloud. They didn't see the trembling hands, the tear-soaked pillows, the weary soul begging heaven for a reason to stay. But God did, and He answered, not always with what you wanted, but always with what you needed. He became your breath when you couldn't breathe. He became your clarity when your mind was clouded with questions. He became your shelter when storms refused to relent. And through every battle, every betrayal, every barren moment, He never left. And that changed everything, because now the pain doesn't define you, the betrayal doesn't bind you. The silence of others no longer drowns your voice. You are no longer seeking validation from people who once wounded you. You've learned to recognize your value through the eyes of the one who formed you. The love they withheld can no longer break you, because you've been loved by a God whose affection knows no end. You don't carry that weight anymore. You don't walk with your head down, begging the past to apologize. You don't wait for closure from people who closed the door without conscience. Because God gave you something greater than closure. He gave you completion. You are not a half-finished story. You are not a wound waiting for a bandage. You are a living testimony of how divine love rebuilds what human hands destroyed. So walk boldly now, not because you're untouched by sorrow, but because sorrow didn't destroy you. Walk forward, not to prove anything to those who doubted you, but because you no longer need to stay in the place they left you. The pit was part of the process, but it was never the final destination. You were never meant to remain where they abandoned you. You were meant to rise. There's a sacred kind of strength that only suffering produces. The kind forged in silence, tested in tears and strengthened through surrender. You didn't ask for that strength, but life demanded it. And when no one else stood by your side, when the world turned its back and the ones you trusted disappeared, God didn't just observe, He moved. Into the center of your emptiness, into the chaos of your heart, into the ache that words could never describe, not as a distant deity, but as a father who saw the depth of your breaking and said, "I'll meet you there." It was in that forsaken place that everything began to shift, not outside of you, but within. You stopped waiting for others to rescue you. You stopped trying to prove your worth to those who never saw it in the first place. You stopped begging for love that was never rooted in truth, and in that moment of release, you found the only love that never needed to be earned, the kind that didn't flinch at your weakness, the kind that stayed when everyone else left. It didn't happen overnight. Healing never does. It unfolded slowly, as if heaven was rewriting every lie they wrote on your soul. One by one, the falsehoods began to fall. You're not enough. Gone. You're too broken. Erased. You'll never recover. Shattered. In their place, a new script began to form, a holy one, etched not in ink, but in grace. You were told you were abandoned, but God called you chosen. You were convinced you were forgotten, but God kept you in His palm. You were certain it was over, but God was just beginning. The silence that once haunted you became the space where you heard Him most clearly. The loneliness that crushed you became the chamber where your spirit finally connected to something eternal. You didn't just survive heartbreak. You were redefined by it. And now, the same pain that once nearly destroyed you has become the proof of your endurance. You no longer need to defend your scars. They tell your story better than words ever could. They are not signs of failure. They are signs that you endured what should have ended you. They show that grace reached you when no one else did, that love found you when you thought it never would again. And now, those wounds don't bleed, they shine. The same God who met you in the pit is the God who walks with you into the promise. But here's what's beautiful. He didn't wait to love you until you healed. He didn't wait until you cleaned up the mess. He sat with you in it, held you while you shook, whispered peace into your rage, gave you rest even when you didn't ask for it. He didn't avoid your darkness. He entered it and lit a flame that couldn't be extinguished. And that light is still burning. You may not realize it, but people around you see it. They see the peace in your eyes that doesn't make sense. They hear the strength in your voice that defies your history. They feel the calm that surrounds you even though they knew your chaos. That's not your doing. That's the residue of presence. That's the fingerprint of the divine. You didn't climb out of the valley on your own. He lifted you, and the mark of His hand is still on your life. You no longer beg for what left, you bless it, because its departure made space for glory. You no longer cry over who walked away. You thank God they did, because their absence became the doorway to intimacy with the one who never leaves. Their silence made room for the voice that never stopped speaking love. Their betrayal led you to the only arms that will never let go. And now you walk differently. You speak with a weight that can't be faked. You love with a depth that only comes from deep wounds. You show up with compassion because you know what it feels like to be invisible. You're not bitter. You're better. Not because life was kind, but because God was present. Let them wonder how. Let them replay their choices. Let them sit with the reality that they hurt someone who was already fighting invisible battles. But don't carry their guilt. Don't hold their shame. You're not their judge. You're the proof that grace is real, that people can be shattered and still shine, that hearts can be wounded and still beat with purpose, that rejection is not the end, it's often the beginning of revelation. And in that revelation, you've come to see this truth clearly. They hurt you when you had no one, but that was the moment God revealed He was everything. You carry something now that can't be explained. It's sensed. It's the depth in your silence, the wisdom in your stillness, the fire behind your gentleness. It wasn't always there. It was forged in the places they thought would ruin you, forged in the loneliness where they expected you to wither, forged in the void where once their presence stood, but where now God's fullness reigns. You carry proof, not in words, not in arguments, but in the quiet authority of someone who has been with God in the wilderness and lived to walk out with light in their eyes. That's why you don't crumble when they speak your name with contempt. That's why you don't chase those who left. That's why you no longer need explanations, because you understand now that God used every absence to multiply His presence. Every goodbye became an invitation into something far more eternal. What they took, God replaced, not just in measure, but in meaning. They'll never grasp how sacred your suffering became. To them, it was probably a moment they've long forgotten, a careless comment, a selfish act, a silent departure. But to you, it was the moment heaven leaned in, the moment your knees hit the floor, not out of weakness, but because the weight of your hurt drove you into the arms of the one who had been waiting all along. The moment your story changed, not by human rescue, but by divine. And now, without trying to prove anything, you stand tall, not because the world changed, but because you did. Not because they apologized, but because you were healed. You're no longer looking to be saved, you've already been found. And what a beautiful thing it is to be found in a place where you were once lost, to feel peace where chaos used to rule, to smile in places where you once broke down, to return to the ruins, not as a captive, but as a conqueror. You don't deny the pain, you remember it, not as a weight, but as a witness. You carry the lessons, the growth, the intimacy with God that came only through that dark season. And you let it remind you, not of who hurt you, but of who healed you. Not of what they stole, but of what you gained. Not of how lonely you were, but of how close God came. He became the voice in your silence, the answer in your confusion, the strength in your weakness. And you discovered that when everything else is gone and only God remains, you have more than enough. In fact, you finally have everything. So now, when you hear of people walking through what you once did, your heart doesn't harden, it softens, because you know what it's like to be abandoned. You know what it's like to feel like you don't matter. You know what it's like to cry in secret, hoping for a sign that God hasn't forgotten you. And because you've been there, you become a vessel, not of judgment but of hope, a living, breathing testimony that they will survive too, that the silence will speak, that the loneliness will end, that God will meet them the same way He met you, right in the middle of it all. They hurt you when you had no one, but you don't live there anymore. You've grown beyond the shadows they left you in. You've learned to see light again, and not just see it, be it. You've learned that being alone doesn't mean being abandoned, that silence isn't emptiness, it's often sacred space, that betrayal can become the path to becoming, that what the enemy used to bury you, God used to bless you. And now when people ask how you made it through, You don't list the names of those who left. You point to the one who stayed. The one who walked with you through fire and didn't let you burn. The one who sat beside you in the dark and never once flinched. The one who saw what they did, counted every tear, and used every ounce of it to shape something eternal inside you. They thought they hurt someone small, but they didn't know they were wounding someone chosen. And chosen ones don't stay down. Because when all else fades, when every false friend disappears, when every worldly foundation crumbles, God remains. Not as an idea, not as a far-off figure, but as everything: breath, purpose, love, power, presence. And that's what they'll never understand. They didn't just walk away from you, they walked away from the sacred becoming. And in doing so, they gave you the greatest gift they never intended to: the space to find out that God is, was, and always will be everything you'll ever need.